Well, I'm very glad to be back this evening. Again, I express my appreciation for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. I've been on the go since I saw you last. Got home late last night, got to bed before midnight, and got up this morning, spent all day at the flea market, left there, came home, came up and got to visit with some good friends at supper. And we drove here, we talked long enough, said, oh, it's time to go, we're going to be late. And so it's just been really good. I've enjoyed it. I want to thank you for your encouragement and your listening ears last night. The song we just sang, Ancient Words, is a powerful song. And I tell people I love the gospel of Christ. It is active. The Word of God will do its work if we are willing for it to do its work. It will divide, Isaiah 55 says, and it will accomplish exactly what God intended. But some of the greatest people that I know in this world have started off from very difficult circumstances. Some had very hard early lives, very difficult situations they came from, deep, deep in the world. And when you look at them now, you wouldn't recognize them as being the same person. That's because they are not. The gospel of Christ is able to change us and make us into what God would have us to be, thanks to the grace and mercy found in Jesus Christ. We worship God, and we are thankful to be able to serve Him. And we appreciate your hearts, that you're concerned about things spiritual. And this evening, as we continue on our study of the home and family, I again encourage each of us, let's open our hearts, just look and think about what God's had to say. All these slides, these overheads, will be on your website before everything is said and done. I went to a lot of work to put these together, in part so that you can go back and look at the passages. I could put most of the passages on just a couple of pages, but this is a little more palatable. And hopefully as we walk through this, it'll be useful for us. If you're visiting with us, we appreciate you being here this evening. We really do feel honored that you are here. And it is our desire to simply to know what God wants and to try to do it. We do that imperfectly, but it's in our heart to know what to do His will. So thank you for being here this evening. We're talking about the home and family relationship tonight. We're talking about the husband-wife relationship. Stan told me last night not to worry about the time, and so I know it was not a short lesson last evening. I really don't know exactly how long it was, but I will try to move through these charts this evening, some of them faster than others. Many that are here are familiar with a number of the passages and some of the concepts that we'll be talking about. I'm not a deep fellow. I don't have some mind that goes to the depths of the ocean. I just sort of say up down there where all the rest of life is, where the fish are, the first top 30 feet of water. I don't know what's down in that deep stuff. But God does, and He put it in His book. And so that's where I need to go. I need to go to the book, and then I can find what God wants. You remember in Mark, the 3rd chapter, verse 25, and other passages, Jesus makes the statement that a kingdom divided will not stand, nor a home that is divided. Of course, He was having to respond to the false Jewish claims against Him, saying that He was doing these miraculous things by the power of Beelzebub. And Jesus shows that's not true. But in the course of that discussion, he makes that observation. A home divided against itself, a house divided, will not stand. There needs to be a unity in our home. And I think there are a number of passages in the New Testament that reflect that. Even in a situation where there's a believer and an unbeliever relationship, God calls us to try to live in peace. That does not mean compromise the Bible or our conviction. It means nothing like that. But trying to humbly submit to the will of God. There's a lady back in Illinois that I talk about from time to time. Her husband had not obeyed the gospel for many years. Matter of fact, at baptizing, it had been 26 years since she had obeyed the gospel and he obeyed the gospel. And after baptizing him, he said, I put the hammer down on her. I made life hard for her those 26 years. But she tried to humbly serve God. She tried to submit herself to her husband. When he would say, I don't want you to go to church, he says, Lord, I love you, and I want to be the finest wife I can, and I want to submit myself to you, but I must first submit my will to God. And she would go with great respect. For the last many years now, they've both been faithfully serving God. All of their children, their grandmates, the grandchildren have obeyed the gospel. The Word of God will work. We just have to take it to heart and do it. And that's what we talked about last night. A lot of times we'll come and we'll do Bible studies, and we like to go down to that deep water and figure and exercise our minds. And I'm all for good Bible study. I study as hard as I can. But when everything's said and done, we can't put it up on the shelf and let it draw dust. It's designed for us to know it, so we can do something about it. That's what Jesus did. He sought to know the Father's will and to do the Father's will, that he might be united with his Father. And so as we study this evening, we want to press forward in that way, trying to find a few things that will help us in our relationship. Of course, the idea associated with marriage as God designed it was a companionship. It was not good for man to be alone. And Genesis 2:24, we find that the leaving and the cleaving to be glued or welded together. And sometimes we'll look at that work, how technically that works and how strong that's supposed to be, and that's exactly right. We're bound together. We talked about being yoked and tied together briefly last night. And in Proverbs 2:17, it talks about a woman who's not being faithful. She has denied the companion of her youth. Here's a partnership, a companionship as God designed it. And this is a blessing from her youth. That's what we find as we look at the Scriptures. Now again, I want to think about this one other point. In the book of Malachi chapter 2 and verse 15, and I realize there's some variations of translations, there's a passage where it says God hates divorce, just a couple verses before that. But what was God desiring? The New American Standard expresses it this way. He was just desiring godly offspring. God wants an offspring in our homes that will serve and honor Him, that will love God and follow Him. We could go back to places like Genesis 18, where Abraham is spoken of. He will command his children, my commandments. He will tell them, I'm going to do all these great things. And so we see that associated with that. We talked a little bit last night about Deuteronomy 6, and how from the heart all these things are driven. As we pull back the curtain in our lives, there's stuff that goes on behind the doors in our homes that sometimes we don't want everybody else to know about. I mean, frankly, we live lives, and sometimes what we see out here is not always what we see back there. And it's not always terrible stuff, but it's not always what they want to be. We all fall short. I told you last night. You know, my wife and I started out with our shared baggage. We'll talk about that, some things like that in just a minute. But let's just be honest with each other. We're working on this marriage relationship. But I want to express another thing as we try to take a candid look. Something that impressed me many years ago is I would see men that were in World War II. They were on a beachhead together. And they hadn't seen each other in lots of years. But they would come together, and there was a dear connection. There was a tie that was there. Because of what they went through, because of what they shared together, the tremendous times, the difficulties, the heartaches. And it created a bond. And I've observed that from men who have gone through some of those things. And I've thought so many times, friends, in our relationship, as husband and wife, that's what we find down the road. Having that beautiful relationship in old age isn't because we look the other way and we decide that we just take the easy way out all the time. It's because we've shared some challenges together. We've had to go through some difficulties, some school hard knocks and bruises, and we're trying to grow up, and things that we didn't expect to face, like we talked about last night. I don't know what's around the corner. But there becomes a bond that grows closer and closer together. I took the picture off here, but I had one of the slides, these two candles that were burning, and the wax was melting together, so it was becoming more and more like one big candle. It had two wicks up there still. And that's the pictures. We see what we have to go through as a husband and wife in the course of time. We're two imperfect people trying to be what God would have us to be. We're working at making the repairs in our own personal life. And we talked about that last night, that marriage is sort of like this melting pot that's going to test us, this crucible that's going to test our character, and it's in our home. We have an opportunity. Hopefully what happens is my wife's weaknesses I can take up, and my weaknesses she can take up, and she can help me overcome some of those problems that I have, and I can help her overcome. That's God's design. work in progress. People like to use that statement. And sometimes they like to use it to excuse their sinful way of life. I'm just a work in progress. Well, I like that concept. But here's the question. Are we making progress? Is that an excuse to continue in our wayward activity and not doing what we ought to do? Is it an excuse? I don't have to really change. I don't have to be what God wants me to be. Now, if you talk about the reality, what it ought to be, yeah, I'm a work in progress. But I need to grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And in the relationship of my marriage, we need to keep working and growing together, as we've talked about. Oftentimes what happens is we come into marriage, we're looking for the perfect mate. Is that so? Well, often we're much more interested in having the perfect mate rather than being the perfect mate. So my question to you or to myself, am I personally trying to work at being that perfect mate? All that God would have me to be. I spend all my time looking at my wife and things she may come up short, I'm going to be dissatisfied. And if she looks at me in that way, she's going to be really dissatisfied. What the Bible really looks at is says, I need to look inward to become more like Christ, whether I'm a man or a woman, to grow in the relationship and responsibilities that God has given. Certainly, as we think about all of this, there are attitudes and actions. Often we know better than we do. That brings us back to knocking the dust back off what God said, get busy doing it. That we come into marriage with a lot of baggage, two imperfect people, as we've said. And I mentioned last night, the secret to marriage that lasted many years is that they were committed. Most marriages have some kind of similar problems. I heard on the radio some years ago, someone was a marriage counselor, and they had counseled hundreds and hundreds of people. And they said, I look at all these people and you think, well, these folks had just had some really horrible problems, and these people over here just had a different set of problems. He said, what you really find out is most of it filters out that most people have the same problems. The question is, what will you do about it? Will you address the problem, make the changes? Or will you let the changes take you down in the wrong direction? So I thought it was a good observation. I know there are many passages we could look at. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 7, I like the New American Standard rendering of that. That's the time where Cain and Abel are spoken of, and Cain is jealous of his brother, and his countenance has fallen, and he gets the best counsel there is. God counsels him. He says, why has your countenance fallen? He goes ahead to say, if you do right, won't your countenance be lifted? But if not, sin is crouching at the door, but you must master it. But what happened is he caved into his jealousy and his envy, and he rose and he murdered Abel. God gave him good counsel. I want you to understand that from this passage, if I didn't have anything else, that there has to be more than counsel given. The counsel has to be received and acted upon. If you have a problem, you go to a counselor. All the counselor can do is give you some guidance and tell you some things to work on and give you direction or give you some things that way. But then you have to do it. And frankly, from my exposure to counseling, for folks that, especially if they're not in the money-making business, say, if you're not willing to invest yourself in this counseling, don't waste my time. I have to be willing to engage and make the changes that need to be made. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, after it talks about wives, wife of an unbelieving husband, in verse 7 talks about husbands, dwell with your wives according to knowledge or understanding. You show her respect. You honor her as the weaker vessel. But remember what he says at the end of that? That your prayers be not hindered. It matters to God how we behave as husbands and wives. And it can not only impact my relationship with my mate, it impacts my relationship with God. Don't be fooled by the devil that God doesn't care about that. He does. From the very beginning, he did. As we think about the home structure, if you turn to the book of Ephesians chapter 5, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 through 31. It's a passage we often refer to, and this is the only real chart we have on this particular passage this evening because we have many things we want to look at. But in the home structure itself, I want to observe that in the creation order, woman was not created inferior to man. She was made from his side. She is his peer as a companion. And I tell people, God saw that I needed a lot of help, so he gave me a good helpmeet. And I mean that. God made the wife as a partner. We are partners in this. There's a difference in the relationship of authority. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Read Ephesians chapter 5. And God put that there. 1 Timothy chapter 2. It goes back to the creation. He made the woman for the man, and then the Eve was deceived. And so the New Testament describes things. But it never ever tells us that there's a superiority or inferiority. As a matter of fact, there are times where by behavior, a lady may express herself and really rise above what her husband is because of her behavior. Not because she's created better, because she's chosen to do what is godly and what is right. So that's not dependent upon he made me male or female. It's dependent upon do I fear God in that regard. But he made us as companions, and that's my point. I like to tell people, it's like a nut and a bolt. You put those together and they work together and hold things together powerfully. But if they're just out there, just loose, they're not going to do their job. And when I talk about a husband and wife being the nut and the bolt, I'm not going to ask you which one's the nut. I'll leave that for your own discretion. But as we think about what God has done, he has created a helpmeet. And I need my wife's help in many ways. Pardon me. In many ways. And again, we go back to Genesis and see that. We're told in our text here in Ephesians chapter 5 that husbands are to love their wives. And of course it tells us as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. In verse 25, we know that. And most of us in here are pretty familiar with that. If we've heard it one time, we've heard it 100 times, haven't we? We've been to this passage lots and lots of times. But as we look at what it says, what does it mean? We are to love our wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Jesus is our example, fellows. He is the standard. Not the neighbor, not the brother down in the congregation. Jesus' love for his bride, the church, is the example and the standard by which we're trying to rise. If you want to bring the standard right down here, then you're not going to have to go very high, are you? But that's not where God put it. He put it in the example of Christ, who gave himself up, who suffered, who took abuse, so that we can live. And it is through his blood that the church can be pure, as the chapter describes here. But he did that out of love for us. Now, something that I have been pointing out in recent years that I think is helpful to me anyway, is that as husbands, we're to have the authority and the lead. We have a responsibility. In 1 Peter chapter 3, Sarah called Abraham Lord, and the expression is there. We are to be the lords in our homes. That's biblical. And by that, again, we're not talking about inferiority, superiority. We're talking about relationship of authority. But look at John chapter 13. And think in verses 12 through 17, when Jesus washed the disciples' feet. You remember what's been going on all along? The disciples are saying, hey, which one of us is the big dog here? I mean, who's really important? Who's the chief guy? All along, Jesus has been teaching that. And finally, the night that he's betrayed, they're still fussing and arguing about that. Who's the greatest? And so you remember, Jesus washes his feet. And then he says, you understand what I'm doing? Yeah. And then he tells them. He says, you call me Lord. And that's right, because I am. But I have washed your feet. I came as a servant. My brothers, that's the kind of lords we are to be in our home. There was an old movie, World War II movie from way back when. And I remember the commanding officer from submarine telling this other guy who thought that uniform just was a ticket to do whatever he wanted. He says the benefits, the advantages of having that command far, far outweigh the privileges. as we are lords in our home, we are there to serve the well-being of our wives and of our children, of our home. We're to be servants. There's no iron-fistedness in that. There's no heartlessness in that. There is a firmness in that. There's determination. There's a direction. There's a commitment. If you would, there is a stubborn determination to humbly do the will of God and to love our wives. Work in her best interest. One of the things I like about that broad brush, that husbands, we're to love our wives, is it gets rid of a lot of those loopholes we like to make. This applies to everything that we do. That I'm working in her best interest. And I'm not going to be exhausted in doing that. I may get tired, I'm not going to get exhausted. I'm going to work for the welfare of her and for my family, for my children. And here we're told that wives are to submit to their husbands and they're to respect their husbands. And this idea of submit means just to put oneself under an authority. Now in the Army, a sergeant and a private is under the authority of the sergeant. The private may be a lot smarter than that sergeant is, but he's still a sergeant. And he's supposed to carry out those commands and directions that he is to submit. And the word in the New Testament that I understand was used outside of the Bible in that way to talk about those military aspects of authority. And so she is under her husband's umbrella of authority, if you would. She has to submit herself to his authority. At least that's what she is supposed to do. And in verse 24, it describes that. In Ephesians 5:24, as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. I've thought about this a lot of times. How well is the church doing and being subject to the Lord? Look at the religious world, not very good. But what the church is to do is to be submissive to our Lord. And he gives us an example for the husband-wife relationship. And as we each provide the part that we're able to provide, it makes the best whole. And out of this, what happens is each partner really has what they want and what they need. If I'm giving everything that I have to try to please my wife, to make her happy, to meet her needs, looking out for her welfare, and she is equally doing that for me, she's looking out for my good, for my needs and my welfare, what kind of relationship do you think that's going to bring about? You and I know what it brings about. The problem is our pride and our self-will, our egos, all that bundle of things get in the way. And sometimes we're not told or we're not seeing exactly what we want. We need to press forward. But the bottom line in this chapter, verse 33, as he concludes this, and of course the idea of this book, Ephesians, is about Christ and the church. But as he talks about the husband and wife here, he says in verse 33, nevertheless, let each individual among you also love his own wife, even as himself. And let the wife see to it that she respects her husband. Or some of the old translations said fear. But she shows respect to him. Husbands, love your wives. Wives, you honor your husbands in the place that God put them. Our society is doing everything it can to destroy that relationship. And cartoons and sitcoms and whatever else stuff, I don't even know what they have on television, but it's all been aimed for several years to make that laughable. And if the husband, the man of the home, is just some kind of adult that can't figure out how to tie his shoes, that's not by accident, as we talked about last night. The devil is behind it. He's trying to destroy the home. But as a child of God, we're going to listen to the maker of the home. Now, this next point I've made for a long time, and I think it's very helpful. That God made us to complement each other, not to compete with each other. And many times that happens in our homes, doesn't it? The husband wants to compete with the wife wants to compete with the husband. I want my will, you want yours, we got this competition, our pride's in the middle of it. That's not what God provided. If you want to know
The smartest brain, talk about a man or a woman, the smartest brain is when you're both one. God made a woman's brain different than a man's brain. He made my wife different than me. And when we complement each other, it makes us the very best that we can be. We're in this together. And I appreciated what Stan said last night, is that, you know, when my wife's gone, I'm not saying exactly what I said, but my wife's gone, there's a part of me that's gone. It's not just saying. And for her as well, even though she's busy. Because we become united together. God made us in this kind of a partnership. Now, there are a couple things that really hurts. Selfishness and a lack of persistence or patience. The number one character quality of successful people is perseverance, one author says. Another fellow says, success flourishes only in perseverance, ceaseless, restless perseverance. It's not that I am smarter, it's just I stay with the problem longer, Einstein said. The point being is let's persevere. And as I read somewhere, consider the postage stamp. Its usefulness consists in the ability to stick to one thing until it gets there. As we talk about our marriages, we must not just say, okay, I want a better marriage, and I want my marriage to be all that God would have it to be, and I'll give it until next week. We just have to persevere through the easy time and the hard times. If you're like me, I go without sleep for a while, and the little bitty things get to be big, and you know, I'm not as patient as I need to be, and you know, that's life. And my wife has to put up with that, and I have to say, well, I'm sorry. I did that this morning. But we just have to stay with it. We just have to persevere. And it's worth it. You need to understand, it is worth it. It's not my intention to talk about this, but I'm going to throw this in. When I was a young man, I understood God had to be the center of everything. But the book of Ecclesiastes helped me a lot when I was in my 20s. You know, so people put their values in their job, and put it in their family, they put it here, they put it there. And the book of Ecclesiastes, that's all empty. I mean, that makes no sense at all if there's no God. But if you put God where He belongs, what I learned was, well, yeah, family's pretty important. And the work you do, that has a great value when God's at the center of everything. So that book tells us that as you live life here, there's some things worthwhile. And right in the heart of much of that is this matter of relationship of a husband and a wife. You go read Ecclesiastes chapter 9 about you want to enjoy life. Enjoy it with the wife of your youth. That's God's intention. But this matter of selfishness, that's a wisdom that's from the devil, not from above. Selfish ambition. That's the calling card of the day, isn't it? It's the promotion of the liberal philosophies that have been being pushed for now many, many years, and is having such a leavening effect upon our whole country. Put that in face of this passage that we're all familiar with. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7, it gives us characteristics about love. Love is patient, love is kind, is not jealous. Love does not brag, is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly, does not seek its own, is not provoked, it does not take into account a wrong suffered. It does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Put that in the face of selfishness. And selfishness will have no helium to lift it off the ground. It's interesting, these are all verbs, by the way. Action, state of mind, state of being. This is the nature of active love. And so as we think about relationship. A friend of mine once said that men want respective response. Ephesians 5, wives, respect your husband. They want her to interact as well. And that women want romantic security. They want to know that they are loved, that there's a warmth that's there, and that's protected, and they have some security. And I think that that's not a bad description that is given. Now, that's not all-inclusive, but it chases in such a way that it gets to the heart of things. Well, let's look at a number of things here. Let's talk for a moment about problem solving. As we mentioned, that this is our homes are work in progress, hopefully. That our homes are under construction, and I put on here That includes my own life personally, as an individual, and that of my wife and as a family, that there are going to be problems that arise. Many years ago, I heard a guy preach a sermon on how to have a good fight. He was talking about marriage. There's going to be disagreements. There's going to be fights. Just count on it. If you're not married yet, I'm just telling you, there are going to be fights. But you fight appropriately. Not the way the devil would have you do. When it says be angry and sin not, that means don't sin. Don't rationalize away. Don't ignore the real problem, and on we could go. And so we have to identify the things that are there. So very quickly, and again, these charts will be available to you. Things that help my marriage, to build bridges and not walls. So we need to work that. Where problems come sometimes is that we get busy building walls instead of trying to work through the problems. So we need to spend time together, Matthew 6:21. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. That's going to be reflected in how we spend our time. I'm not suggesting that we can't spend our time out doing a little bit of fishing once in a while, so I like to fish, or riding a motorcycle, or sewing, or we can do some of those things. We need a balance of things. Go read Proverbs 31. But we find in this that where our heart really is where our treasures have been buried. That's where we're going to be. And so things that will help our relationship. We talk about husband and wife. Tomorrow we talk about raising children. We're going to spend time together. And I know that's hard. And we have to work at it. And sometimes what that means is we need to throw some of this other junk out the window that gets in our way and spend time with people, with each other, with a wife. I want to continue spending my life winning her heart until we're not breathing this air. So spend time together. Get our thinking on track. As a man thinketh in himself, so is he. Now we'll go into a little context and all there, but really what's inside. Our thinking, we got to get straightened out. Think on the things that are good in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. Learn to touch appropriately. If you would turn with me to Genesis chapter 26 and verse 8. Genesis chapter 26 and verse 8. That I was talking to a friend of mine back in Illinois. We're getting ready to do some teaching. We have a training class back there we've done for about 10 years. And to make sure that we weren't going down the same path, we're talking about some marriage things. And acting like men is the theme for that 1 hour slot in the afternoon. He's talking about husbands, and I'm going to talk about being fathers. But one of the things that we find that back in maybe my generation or the previous generation, there's sort of a don't touch world. But we did not do that in our home. And I put up here and underlined this idea appropriately. When I go by, I'll touch my wife's shoulder. I'll put my arm around her. I'll give her a kiss on the way by. When our children were growing up, they saw that. I have no apologies for that. Matter of fact, I'm thankful for that. And my friend that called me yesterday, he said, oh yeah, the kids would go, ooh. But in the research that he was doing, which I've got to get busy doing, he said in a world that is upside down, when so many families are not surviving, it is a reassurance to our children that our relationship is good. It is a blanket of security to them that mom and dad really love each other. I'm not ashamed of that. Now, I'm not talking about inappropriately. Use some good taste here. But again, our children learn what a healthy relationship is when they see a healthy relationship. In Genesis 26 and in verse 8, and again reading from the New American Standard, there's a problem with Abimelech in these verses, I'm not even going into that for time. It came about that when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out through a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was caressing his wife, Rebekah. Now this word caressing, I've written in my Bible, is from a root word that means to laugh, i.e. a closeness and an affection. You can see that. It's observable. There's a warmth that is there.
Husbands, you treat your wife with purity and respect and warmth. And wives, you treat your husbands that way. You respect him as the husband, as the Lord of your home, with the warmth of your heart as well. Those things will help our marriage. If we throw water on the fire, it doesn't help a marriage, does it? We need to talk and communicate, which we'll talk about it. We need to respect and honor, which we've already talked about. A top 10 complaint in surveys is too much screen time and gaming on the part of men. I'm not a gamer. I have spent too much screen time. But this is a common complaint. My husband's more interested in gaming than he is in some things that are important. I'm just going to be real blunt about this. What does that gaming have to do with anything in this world anyway? Except me. I'm having fun. And I'm going to be a real person. What about putting a little ball through a hoop up on the wall, or a pigskin down through upper goals? Really matter in life. In the final analysis, that's nothing but entertainment. Now, I'm not against playing football or basketball. Our kids from track and basketball and football, they did something else. But that's not what life is about. Life isn't basketball, contrary to what some t-shirts have said. As we look at these things, fellas, I don't know what your situation is, or families, as you think about your children growing up, to put some regulations and all in there to help them with that. But this is a common complaint because it is a common problem. So take it for what it's worth. Look at it, see, does that impact you? Now, as we said, troubles come up. And in the family situation, there are fights that come up. When a problem arises, what do? Do you fight each other? Is that what you should do when a problem comes up? If we were in a room and there was only one exit, and my wife and I are over here and there's a big fire that pops up, do we need to spend our time fighting each other, or do we need to fight the fire? We need to resolve the problem. We don't need to be fighting each other. Here's the problem. Now let's work on it. What would God have us to do? Fight the fire, not each other. Work on resolving those things. And again, it's going to take patience. It's going to take a lack of being selfish. It's going to take, on a husband's part, I've got to put her ahead and above me. And from a wife, I've got to put him above me. We've worked at getting through the problems. In the book of Ephesians chapter 4, and again this will be very brief, but what about as we have problems? I ran across this many years ago, and I like this. I love this text anyway. But I'm just going to pull all these up here for time's sake. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25, lay aside falsehood. Speak truth, each one of you, with his neighbor, for we are members one of the other. Now, this isn't talk about the family, this is talking about a Christian's relationship. In working through these problems, we need to be honest with each other. For those of you who may be younger in your marriages, oftentimes what happens is folks get married and you're afraid to say, well, no, here's really what's going on in my life. Here's what I'm really feeling. And it takes a while to unload that baggage. I realize that you have to use some wisdom and judgment about that. But be honest with each other. Even if you have to say, well, there's some things maybe we can talk about sometime, but I really don't think I can do it right now. That's honest. But then talk about them. Work through those things. So in coming up with problems, be honest with each other. I didn't say be crude, insensitive, mean, harsh. No, I didn't say any of that. Just be honest.
Secondly, don't lie about it. Don't fib about it. Secondly, handle the problem immediately. This is the verse 26 and 7 that talk about anger. Don't let the sun go down. Right? You remember that? In verse 26, be angry, yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. So when a problem comes up, deal with it now. Now again, by now I understand if the flames are so big right now, so we need to talk about this in the morning because I am boiling inside and it's not the wisest thing to deal with it tonight. I'm not going to fuss about that. But deal with it immediately. Don't put it off, because what happens is on a hot water heater, there's something called a pressure release valve on there. When the pressure gets so big, to keep that thing from blowing up, it lets off a little bit of steam on that to keep there from being a bomb go on. We can't just leave it inside and not deal with it. We need to deal with the problem. Sometimes you got to let a little of that pressure off little by little, certainly. But we need to deal with it immediately. Never sponge off the other one. Here it's talking about laboring in general. Don't sponge off your mate. One of the things that I realized many years ago in studying Proverbs 31, when I was just early in my Christian life, I got done studying that, getting ready to teach it. One of the things that just stands up, this is an industrious woman. She's not sitting in front of the TV all afternoon eating chocolate and doing nothing. And her husband wasn't either. We're talking about something called industry. Read the book of Proverbs. Go to the ant, the sluggard's told. And so we need to be industrious. Don't sponge off of your partner. You work together in this. Let no corrupt word come from your mouth, but only that which will edify. And you notice as you read this, and let's read verse 29. Let no unwholesome word or no corrupt word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment, that it may give grace to those who hear. Notice that. The goal is to impart grace to the hearer, not to yourself. These words aren't just to make me feel good, but this favor, I'm trying to help her, or I'm trying to help him. That's the kind of speech that needs to come from my mouth. Now, for that kind of speech to come from my mouth, what drives that tongue is what's in the heart. But that's the kind of speech. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit. And we go back to Romans 12 where it talks about vengeance is mine. Do not return evil for evil, but overcome evil with good. As you go back and read Romans chapter 12. But here's another thing. I didn't put that up yet. We need to attack the problem and not the person. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. And then the last verse. This is an important part of this. Forgive as Christ forgave you. A marriage that cannot have forgiveness in it is a marriage that is destined to nothing but trouble and heartache. We have to be bigger than the problem. We have to be willing to forgive, but not only that, we're told, you forgive. Here's it's all about our brothers and sisters. But in a marriage relationship, you forgive your wife. Remember, Christ forgave you. And you did a lot more wrong toward him than your wife or your husband done toward you. Go read Matthew 18. And that forgiveness must come from the heart. Right here and right now, that's what it is. I have to be willing before God from my heart to forgive my mate. It's not some words. It's not an expression to appease other people. It is an expression of forgiveness from the heart. Now, that forgiveness means this. I will not bring this debt up again in the future against you. I realize that there are some images that are still in the head, and there is some pain that may be there from the things that happen. That's reality. But this matter of forgiveness means I will forgive you. This debt will be forgiven, and it will not be brought up against you again as a debt. This is not a club I can beat you with. This is not a button that I can push. All that's out
of the way. I cannot function in that way. But I can fall down on this rug. And of course, 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7. Secondly, I want to talk about another subject. Back about 16 years ago, 17 years ago, Persian Gulf War, General Schwarzkopf led forces, directed forces, and took Saddam Hussein down some notches. He was being interviewed after all that and made a statement that was impressive to me. He was asked about, what was your first effort in this attack? And he says, to take out your communication. It wasn't the fuel depot, it wasn't the ammunition depot, it wasn't the weapons storage. It was take out your communication. And the devil likes to do that in our marriages. Let's quit talking. Now, most of the time, the general rule is that women are more talky than guys are. Matter of fact, one of the claims is, oh, he won't talk, he won't talk. Now, I know some situations it's the other way around. She won't talk and he will. He won't shut up. But generally that's the case. But either way, this communication has to go forward. For our homes, our relationship as a husband and wife to be healthy. This word communication comes from the Latin to have in common, as you can see in the first part of this word. To make the information common to both parties. It has a sender, receiver, and an understood message. There are many ways, words, actions, and gestures that we express this. When I was in India many years ago, I worked with a fellow named V.J. Benson. His wife's named Matilda. And we got to be pretty close. And Matilda said one day, he says, Americans waste many words. Men waste many words on their wives. You see, Benson shows me that he loves me by his action. Well, those words aren't a waste. And she was over-expressing the point. Is that sometimes we talk and talk and talk. But she says, when I know that the rubber really hits the road, is when he does what he does. And I think that's great. Proverbs 18:21, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. We communicate in a lot of other ways besides the words that we give. You may recognize these 6 universal expressions. They've been around, they've been in textbooks for lots and lots of years. And you see sadness, happiness, surprise, anger, disgust, and fear. All expressions of the faith. And when we're talking, oftentimes we read those gestures just as well as we hear the words. And sometimes they're communicating a lot more than the words. I will be honest with you, sometimes we misread some of those gestures. I may be frustrated with something else. I'm under a lot of other stress, and I'm not stressed towards my wife. That's a possibility. But just bear in mind, the rule of thumb is, yeah, our words are saying something, but so are our expressions. We communicate in a number of ways. And so we need to be mindful of that. Some helpful passages thinking about communication. I love Proverbs 15:1. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. If you've ever been around domestic squabbles, man, can make it loud. He gets louder, she gets louder, he gets louder, she gets louder, and finally they're full volume on both sides. And you're thinking, wow, how did it ever get there? This admonition says when you're starting to feel like to ratchet up, rather than turning it up, you turn it down. Tone it down. And I'm wired pretty tight, so I have to be mindful of that. In James 1:19, quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Proverbs 18:13, he who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him. 13:3, the one who guards his mouth preserves his life. The one who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. Ephesians 4:29, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear, as we just noticed. What happens is there can be a chill in marriage. And it's been a classic word. She gave me the cold shoulder. Or things are pretty frigid. The relationship's cold. All we want to do is rekindle the fire. As in Ephesians chapter 5, a moment ago, We were talking about this matter of love and respect and things spoken of here. Verse 29, it says, "For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church." That term is only used, this warmth here, this cherishing, one other time. That's in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 7. Talking about the tenderness as Paul came bringing the gospel to the Thessalonians. He describes it like this nursing mother with this little baby. Now, what does any kind of a decent mother do with that little baby? Toss him up in the air, bounce him across the floor? No. Tender, kind, protective. We have an adage in talking about bears: you don't come between a mama and her cubs or you're going to be in trouble. Why? Because she cares for that. Mama cares for that little child. Paul says, that's how I came to you, Thessalonians. But that's the term that's described here for us as husbands. And by definition, Vine says it means to heat, to soften by heat, then to keep warm, as of birds covering their young with their feathers. Deuteronomy 22:6. And the Septuagint, metaphorically, to cherish with tender love, to foster with tender care, as a nurse for her children, like in 1 Thessalonians 2:7. That's this term. In Ephesians 5, it talks about as Christ cherishing and nurturing. That's what husbands are doing. Are you warm towards your wife? We can melt a lot of ice. Proverbs 19:22, what is desirable in a man is his kindness. That came from the NIV. But notice my red box at the bottom. Sarcasm and a critical spirit crush warm feelings. You cannot, fellows, crush your wife's feelings with harsh, sarcastic, critical terms and say, oh, forget about it, and go on, you forget about it, but she doesn't. She's got scar tissue. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, is not true. It doesn't send me physically to the hospital, but it takes my heart to the ambulance. And so we need to melt this ice. Now, I preached a lesson one time entitled Being Intoxicated Without a Bottle or Pills. And so I'm going to inject something here. If this was simply an all-marrieds class, we've been talking in a lot more detail about this. In Proverbs chapter 5, verses 15 through 23, it talks about the marriage relationship there in terms that are poetic, I'll just say it that way. And we find that it uses a word in Proverbs chapter 5 that's talking about the intimacy of the husband and the wife relationship. I want to speak vaguely enough, not to step across the line. I want to speak clearly enough that we do not miss this. The Bible talks very particularly about the relationship that we have as husbands and wives. And this intimate relationship is a critical part. In the New American Standard, it uses in verse 19, as it describes this closeness of the husband-wife relationship, be exhilarated always with her love. The footnote says literally intoxicated. The ESV, the English Standard Version, puts intoxicated in the text itself. These passions are real and they are powerful. They are intoxicating. But it does not only talk about that here with a man and his wife. If you keep reading, it says in verse 20, for why should you, my son, be exhilarated, same term, with an adulteress? This intimacy is a powerful thing, and it impacts your brain chemistry in critical ways. Very wisely designed by the great power and wisdom of God to bring a husband and wife so close together inside. That's what God designed. As we said, He created it very, very good. 1 Corinthians 7 gives some rules about that. I'm not mine anymore, I'm hers. She's not hers anymore, she is mine. That's always under the umbrella of love. Anything that I do with her that way and she does with me is under the umbrella of love.
I've got to consider her well-being, and she mine in these matters. But 1 Corinthians 7 talks about that, and I should not steal from my wife. I should not defraud her. That's the word for steal, basically. Used in a previous chapter about defrauding. And really the chapter says because of sexual immorality, because of fornication, let each man have his own wife, and each woman have her own husband. These passions are some of the strongest among humanity. The devil has used them powerfully. The word sex is not a dirty word. It's not a shameful thing to talk about in a good, holy way with our children. They need to hear what good sex is, what God designed as a husband and wife alone. And God, in His wisdom, brought that together because the world is going to broadcast and is broadcasting everywhere, every perversion of that. And if that's all they hear, then what do you expect them to know? They need to see in us, as I reach over and touch my wife's shoulder, as I put my arm around her, as I give her a kiss on the cheek as I go by, that I am warm towards her and she towards me, and we towards them. Appropriately all the way. But here's the husband and wife relationship. Quit worrying about pleasing yourself. Set your mind on pleasing your man. Fellas, we need to learn that. And ladies, we need to learn that also. God designed us in such a way that we will find the greatest blessing in giving. As I said earlier about other relationships and our wife, my intention is to please her and her to please me. We're both going to end up in a good place. It said in chapter 5 and verse 19, be intoxicated. And in the rest of the chapter, it says, don't be tempted by some other woman. And you can see this keyboard up here. I had a graphic that I used one time that was a little more explicit, not rude. But my granddaughter saw them, and she was really innocent. I didn't use it again. But pornography is rampant. It is like the Black Plague in our country. Some 15 or 20 years ago, when I was doing some research for a lesson that I was supposed to give, there was a group called the Promise Keepers, basically a denominational group that said we want to be better husbands. And so there are thousands of guys who come together. They did a survey. This is 15 or 20 years ago. And it was something like 52 or 53% of those men, 15 or 20 years ago, remember, had looked at pornography within the last 3 weeks. That shocked me. That's why I still remember. It's worse than that now. It's way worse than that. And our children are being fished for by professionals through the internet, trying to get them innocently to look at things they ought not, because the chemistry and the passions that ultimately come with that are real and they're addictive. There's a book that I become familiar with a couple of years ago, and it is called The Drug of the New Millennium. And it was a helpful book to me. There's another number of other books. But back 15 or 20 years ago when I was doing that research, I found some material by a neurosurgeon, and he was describing the chemical changes that take place in the brain. Well, this book documents that. The Drug of the New Millennium. You get it on Amazon. But it talks about the nuts and bolts and what that does in changing chemistry, how it gets rid of the restraints that are up here, how it gives a thrill. God designed that thrill and that searing impact of seeing those things for a wife and relationship that a man has, so that, man, she is in my mind and in my heart. That's what God in His wisdom designed. And the devil came along and said, hey, man, oh man, do I have a tool here. If I can get you to look somewhere else. And he's been using television and changing our thinking for decades now. And this powerful tool of the internet, billions of dollars made. What happens is destructive cycle. This is a destructive cycle. Let me see. My computer has got that spinning ball. I don't like that.
happens is there's a destructive cycle that takes place. And in this destructive cycle, things go downhill. And as they go downhill, they become more troublesome. And I can get here. We're almost done. There's no affection. So there's a certain coldness. And then there's no intimacy or limited intimacy, which creates more coldness, which creates less affection and less intimacy. It is a downhill spiral. But I have this little figure over here, is we can make some choices about that to change it. Be honest with each other, be open with each other, repent those things that aren't right in this, and be patient with each other. You help each other work through these things. These are critical issues. And I'm telling you that there's no gaming about this. This is life and death stuff. It's impacting the souls of people and the happiness of people. It's a cancer. Go back to your Bible and you can see what is wholesome and healthy in this relationship. And understand, it is a wonderful thing as God designed it. You have to work through the challenges. And sometimes there are physiological things as well as psychological things that are into it. But I want to suggest marriage is worth it. It is the right thing to do. And it pays wonderful dividends. As I said last night, my wife is the best friend that I have in this world. We've had our challenges. We haven't done it perfectly. We're thankful for where we're at right now, and we're looking forward to doing better. But by the wisdom of God, it'll bless us. What do we do if we find ourselves drifting? In Hebrews chapter 2 and in verse 1, it says they're talking about spiritual things. It's talking about drifting back towards Judaism. But that same principle, we find ourselves drifting. We've got to pay closer attention to the reality, to what God has delivered. Early in our life, we get busy with work, with our hobbies, with our self-interest. In the middle of life, we get busy with all the above and children. Later on, we get an empty nest, and we get who is that moment? Keep that relationship alive. Keep love alive through those years. And what happens if you're in a situation where you have a mate who just will not cooperate? Don't write them off and say they won't, without you keep being patient and selfless and trying. But there are certainly times where there can be a lack of cooperation. Or sometimes, maybe if a person has become a Christian, their mate is hateful about that and say, you're going to pay. Here's some passages. You see the kind of example. It talks about a woman that has an unbelieving husband, 1 Peter 3. 1 Corinthians 7, 12 through 16. A person becomes a Christian and their mate's not a Christian. The challenges that are there, it gives them instruction. In 1 Peter 2, 18 through 23, is find favor with God. If we suffer unjustly, if we do what's wrong and we suffer, it's just got what you deserve. That's the way that works. If you do evil and suffer for it, that comes with it. But if you do what's right and you suffer for it, to the glory of God, God is going to be glorified. And then later in Colossians 3, 22 through 25, it's all about servants. A servant who has a master that may not do what he's supposed to do, and he just says, you just remember, you're serving the Lord. There's a higher purpose than my wife or a higher purpose than my husband. In my marriage relationship, I am the Lord's servant. I'm trying to do what pleases Him. I tell you, that's a comfort. If your husband's a bonehead, or your wife's a bonehead, and you say, I'm going to do what's right in this. I'm serving my Lord. I'm serving my Master. And He'll bring me through. And it's worth it. There will be mountains to climb on the road of marriage. If you will do it together, the view is good from the top and even better from the turn. Thank you for listening this evening. It is really hard to figure out what to say in a short lesson like this about such a broad subject. And 4 lessons for this whole subject is It's hard to get 10 pounds of sugar in a 5-pound bag. But thank you for listening so carefully. I hope the things that we talked about this evening are true to the Word of God and true to God's will. If they are not, if you will bring it to my attention afterwards, I will make correction of that if I've spoken anything that's in error. If it's not true to God's Word. Like I said last night, I'd like to just be able to sit down in a chair down in front. We can just talk about these things. But there's the other side of this. If these things are true, and if we're not doing what we're supposed to, we'll repent of that. Say, Lord, I'm sorry. It's been a struggle for me, but I'm going to try to do better. I'll talk to my husband or my wife. Say, sweetheart, I love you, and I know we've struggled through here. Just pick up, we'll go forward. X marks the spot. We're here. Won't you forgive me, and I'll forgive you. We'll listen to the Lord, and we'll build by His wisdom in whatever days He gives us. Thank you for listening. This chart, Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized will be saved. He that disbelieveth will be condemned. Mark chapter 16, verse 15 and 16. If you want to see a commentary on that, read the book of Acts. And when I'm preaching this message, you see how people became Christian. They believed Jesus Christ was the Son of God. They repented of their sins. Read that, Acts 2:38, for the first time in Acts. They confessed Jesus was the Son of God. And then they were immersed, they were baptized in water for the forgiveness of their sins. And then with purpose of heart, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, they continued to follow Him. Matthew 28:20, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age, or the end of the world. That's Christ's invitation. And if you're subject to it this evening, won't you come forward as we stand? As we stand.